Blackshirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. Section: Colonizing the East. Once the capitalist restorationists in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union took state power, they worked hard to make sure that the new order of corporate plunder, individual greed, low wages, mindless pop culture, and limited electoral democracy would take hold. They set about dismantling public ownership of production and the entire network of social programs that once served the public. They integrated the erstwhile communist countries into the global capitalist system by expropriating their land, labor, natural resources, and markets, swiftly transforming them into impoverished third-world nations. All this was hailed in the U.S. corporate-owned press as a great advance for humanity. The former communist nations are being recolonized by Western capital. Most of their foreign trade is now controlled by multinational corporations. Like third world countries, they are increasingly deprived of each other's markets. The once heavy and mutually beneficial commerce between them has been reduced to a trickle, as their economies get tied to the investment and extractive needs of global capitalism. Instead of mutual development, they are now experiencing the maldevelopment imposed by global monopoly capital. Multinational corporations are moving into Russia to exploit vast oil and natural gas reserves and rich mineral deposits at great profit to themselves and with little benefit to the Russian people. Over the protests of U.S. and Russian environmentalists, U.S. timber interests, with financial support from a venture fund sponsored by the Pentagon, are preparing to clear-cut the Siberian wilderness, a region that holds 1/5 of the planet's forests and is the habitat of many rare species. All aid to the former communist countries is funneled into the private sector. As noted in The Guardian, 1994, quote, "The hundreds of millions of dollars spawned by Western aid programs have mainly benefited the Western companies which headed east to board the aid gravy train." End quote. When Romania inaugurated an over-the-top market for trading privatization shares, the $20 million in startup costs were largely covered by the U.S. Agency for International Development. End quote. In 1996, the International Monetary Fund extended a $10.2 billion loan to Russia, with terms calling for the privatization of agriculture and other state-owned assets, and the elimination of human services and fuel subsidies. U.S. aid is used to help private investors buy public property and extract publicly owned raw materials from Eastern European countries under the most favorable investment conditions. With the advent of private investment in the East, production did not grow as promised, but dropped drastically. Hundreds of the more attractive and solvent state enterprises have been privatized, often given away at token prices to foreign investors, while other state firms are decapitated or driven into bankruptcy. Between 1989 and 1995, in what is now the Czech Republic, nearly 80% of all enterprises were privatized, and industrial production shrank by 2/3. Privatization in Poland caused production to shrink 1/3 between 1989 and 92. Vast electronic and high-tech complexes in East Germany, employing tens of thousands of workers, have been taken over by giant West German firms and then closed down. Under privatization, much of the former Soviet Union's scientific and technical infrastructure is disintegrating, along with its physical plants. Since going private, ZIL, the huge Moscow plant, saw its production of trucks slump from 150,000 to 13,000 a year, with almost 40% of the workforce laid off. In April 1996, the remaining workers petitioned the Russian government to take back control of ZIL. In the past, ZIL workers and their relatives, quote, had unshakably safe jobs at the factory. They lived in apartments and attended schools provided by ZIL. As babies, they spent their days at the ZIL daycare center, and when ill, they were attended to by ZIL doctors. Quote, I was raised in a country that cared about its workers, said one machinist, who now was sorry he had opposed that system. From the New York Times, 1994. In Macedonia, one of the breakaway republics of Yugoslavia, a labor representative noted, quote, privatization seems to mean the destruction of our companies, end quote. Macedonians seemed more troubled by free market economic hardships than by the much publicized ethnic rivalries. They complained about how work has taken over their lives. Quote, one has no time to care about others. There's no time even for oneself, only time for making money. End quote. From a PBS TV report, 1995. Agricultural output of grain, corn, livestock, and other products plummeted in the former communist countries, as thousands of cooperative farms were forcibly broken up. The new private farmers have small plots, often cannot get loans, seeds, fertilizer, or machinery, and are rapidly losing their holdings or reverting to subsistence farming. Hungary's agricultural cooperatives had been one sector of the socialist economy that performed well. But with privatization, farm output tumbled 40% in 1993. A drastic deterioration in agricultural production occurred in Bulgaria, once considered the breadbasket of Eastern Europe, causing severe bread shortages by 1996. Bulgaria was also suffering from a 20% monthly inflation and was sinking into that familiar cycle of foreign debt. Cutting back on services to qualify for IMF loans, borrowing to pay off past borrowing. Quote, the Bulgarian government must impose more free market austerity measures to get vital international loans to repay portions of the $9.4 billion foreign debt. End quote. From the San Francisco Chronicle, 1996. In 1992, the Lithuanian government decreed that former owners and their descendants could reclaim property confiscated during the socialist era. As a result, tens of thousands of farming families, about 70% of the rural population, were evicted from land they had worked for over half a century, destroying the country's agricultural base in the process. Much production in East Germany was dismantled to prevent competition with West German firms. This was especially evident when collective agriculture was broken up to protect the heavily subsidized and less productive private farms of West Germany. Without making compensation, West German capitalists grabbed almost all the socialized property in the GDR, including factories, mills, farms, apartments, and other real estate, and the medical care system, assets worth about $2 trillion, in what has amounted to the largest expropriation of public wealth by private capital in European history. The end result of all this free market privatization in East Germany is that rents, once 5% of one's income, have climbed to as much as 2/3. Likewise, the costs of transportation, childcare, healthcare, and higher education have soared beyond the reach of many. East Germans of various political stripes have a number of complaints. A. The net money flow has been east to west in what amounts to a colonization of the East. B. The free market is a myth. The West German economy is heavily subsidized and fully regulated, but against the interests of the East. C. West German police are more brutal than were the East German police. D. If West Germany had denazified anywhere near as thoroughly as it forced the East to desocialize, it would be a totally different country. On that last point, it should be noted that German officials are bringing criminal charges against those who, quote, collaborated with the GDR of East Germany in any official capacity, including even teachers and minor administrators. Footnote. Several thousand former GDR officials, judges, and others have been imprisoned or are facing prison terms for, quote, treason. See the discussion in Chapter 5. End footnote. Émigrés from communist states are astonished by the amount of bureaucracy they find in the West. 2 Soviet immigrants to Canada complained, independently of each other, that, quote, bureaucracy here was even worse than at home, end quote. From the Monthly Review, 1988. East Germans living in the West were staggered by the flood of complicated forms they had to fill out for taxes, health insurance, life insurance, unemployment compensation, job retraining, rent subsidies, and bank accounts. Furthermore, quote, because of the kind of personal information they had to give, they felt more observed and spied on than they were by the Stasi, the GDR security police. End quote. From Z Magazine, 1992. Soviet Jews who emigrated to Israel during the Cold War era experienced a similar disillusionment with the difficulties of life and lack of idealism. The discouraging letters they sent home were considered an important factor in the drop in immigration from the USSR to Israel. With the capitalist restoration in full swing, the peoples of the former communist nations had ample opportunity to learn what life was like in the free market paradise. Their experiences are detailed in the next chapter. End of section.